To understand the divisions that led to the unthinkable catastrophe, we must first understand the time Rwandans call before. Several centuries ago, three groups came to inhabit what is today Rwanda. The Twa Pygmies eventually made up only 1% of the population. The majority Hutu came to outnumber the Tutsi almost 8 to 1. Hutus and Tutsis were defined mainly by class and clan, not ethnicity. Generally, Hutus were peasant cultivators, Tutsis were cattle owners. The greater wealth gained from ownership of livestock helped to propel Tutsis into political power. But in pre-colonial Rwanda, lines between classes were indistinct.
You're talking of a population where the vast majority has Hutu and Tutsi parentage in their background. Anybody who was a Hutu, who became prosperous enough, could ritually shed their status of being Hutu and become a Tutsi. So Tutsi was a porous identity.
Europeans who ventured to Africa in the 19th century further clouded the issue. After an expedition to Rwanda in the late 1800s, the explorer John Hanning Speke was the first to hypothesize about Tutsi superiority.
This is actually very standard 19th century Victorian racism. He describes it as the flat-nosed, flab-mouthed Negro, whom he compares to the baboon and is utterly uneducable and quite a disgrace. But then he says, but amongst them is this other group who are in every way superior.
In 1919, under a League of Nations mandate, Rwanda became a Belgian protectorate. Belgian administrators installed Catholicism, the French language, and reinforced faulty racial science.
They brought in the usual tools of colonization, they brought in some guns, and they brought in some administrators, but they also brought in things like calipers in order to measure the cranial capacity to determine what's a true Hutu, what's a true Tutsi. They actually had something called a nasal index, by which they measured the size and shape of people's noses to determine who was racially superior and racially inferior. This is Third Reich stuff, and this was the foundational stuff of Rwanda.
Belgian Christian missionaries and Tutsi leaders collaborated to consolidate the idea of a Tutsi aristocracy. Hutus were denied government positions, higher education, and were subjected to forced labor. An ethnic divide became institutionalized. By the late 1930s, all ambiguity about ethnic identity was eradicated.
Every Rwandan would be given an identity card which said your name, and then it also said your ethnicity. And these cards became, like apartheid ID cards, they became a tool of social control. This was the apparatus of the colonial state. It was the apparatus of oppression of Hutu.
By the 1950s, the Tutsi elite was clamoring for an independent Rwanda. But the Hutus' simmering resentment towards the Tutsi establishment and the Belgians who supported it had reached boiling point.
It was almost a civil rights movement at that point, and it quickly became a revolutionary movement that identified Tutsis and colonialism as two wrongs to be gotten rid of simultaneously.
In 1959, social tension exploded into revolution. Belgian organized elections resulted in the majority Hutus winning by a landslide, and a violent backlash against Tutsis ensued.
It was the flipping on its head of an unjust system. The oppressed became the oppressor, and in 1959, 1960, as this revolution took place, as violence flared, you saw the first massacres of what many people consider to be the genocidal order.
Immediately, Tutsis began to flee the country. Then in 1962, Belgium granted Hutu-controlled Rwanda its independence.
The truly poisonous institutional legacy of the colonial state was that Hutu and Tutsi were two different races. The real tragedy was that the Rwandan Revolution failed to transcend this legacy.
The Tutsis, in turn, became the persecuted minority. Over the course of the next decade, more than 20,000 Tutsis were killed, and the number of Tutsis who fled to neighboring countries swelled. In 1973, Hutu Army Commander Juvenal Habyarimana seized power in a bloodless coup. The new president offered security to Tutsis still in the country, but failed to effectively respond to the trouble brewing across Rwanda's borders.
The problem the Second Republic could not solve and did not even wish to address and thought would go away in ostrich-like fashion was the problem of the Tutsi exiles.
But the Tutsi exiles would not go away. In Uganda, they formed a rebel army soon to be known as the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front. One of its leaders was Paul Kagame, who later became Rwanda's president. In the early 1980s, he had only one concern.
It came to a point where we could no longer continue being stateless, and we could not be stateless forever.
The RPF prepared for the day they would win the right of return for Tutsi refugees, if necessary, by force. When President Habyarimana took control of Rwanda in 1973, the widespread attacks against Tutsis stopped. The president promised security to Tutsis and granted the minority population proportional participation in social and political institutions. The country experienced relative calm and prosperity, but long-standing resentments lingered. In schools, the seeds of division were replanted in the impressionable minds of both Hutu and Tutsi children.
Would often be told, Hutus please stand, or Tutsis please stand. A child would go home knowing for sure they were Hutu or Tutsi.
The teaching of hatred started back in 1959. When you teach a primary school child, you teach him to hate. 17 years, 20 years later, you cannot change, because the brain is like a computer. If you put a virus, then you change completely.
By the 1980s, Rwanda was changing. Economic crises and famine crippled the country. Citing overpopulation as his reason, President Habyarimana sealed Rwanda's borders to exiled Tutsis wanting to return home, effectively leaving an estimated 700,000 refugees in neighboring countries. In 1986, Uganda granted Tutsis in its country citizenship, but after a public outcry, revoked it 4 years later. Stateless, the men of the RPF, the Tutsi rebel army, decided to fight their way back home. On the 1st of October 1990, they invaded Rwanda. Civil war engulfed the tiny nation. The RPF was accused of targeting innocent Hutu civilians, but fighting was brutal on both sides. Support for President Habyarimana evaporated.
You'd have political divisions within the large Hutu majority. You'd have different parties or different factions, and whenever that happened, whoever was in power would try to consolidate the Hutu political center around the idea of a common enemy. And sure enough, conveniently, the RPF attacks at that point, and the thing actually starts to have a kind of narrative logic to it.
The RPF attacks increased Hutu anger against Tutsi civilians. The common enemy was soon considered to be not just the invading army, but every Tutsi man, woman, and child still living in Rwanda.
I think in the absence of civil war, I doubt if there could have been a genocide in Rwanda. Most genocides have been rationalized, mobilized, organized, explained as preemptive actions. Do to them what they will do to you before they do it to you.
A common philosophy emerged from extremist political factions. Hutu power espoused a virulent Hutu supremacist philosophy. Under the guise of self-defense, many parties formed armed youth wings. Some, like the Interahamwe, translated as those who attack together, received training from the government and French military advisors. A systematic campaign of hate rhetoric swept across Rwanda. Purveyors of fear flourished. Newspapers mocked Tutsis in malicious cartoons. In 1990, the overtly racist newspaper Kangura published the Hutu 10 Commandments, a manifesto defining rules of conduct between Hutus and Tutsis.
Marries a Tutsi woman, befriends a Tutsi woman, employs a Tutsi woman, shall be considered a traitor. The Hutu should stop having mercy on the Tutsi.
Quasi-religious sermons turned to thinly veiled threats. In 1992, Leon Mugesera, a high-ranking party official, delivered an inflammatory warning to Tutsis.
Leon basically said the Tutsi were an impurity. They had come from elsewhere. They had come from Ethiopia, and they must go back to Ethiopia. and they must go back to Ethiopia not as living Tutsi, but as dead Tutsi.
Extremist-supported RTLM radio became the voice of the vitriolic hate. The enemy was dehumanized, called snakes and cockroaches.
The radio station was a brilliant instrument of propaganda. First thing they did is they played rock music and good music that enticed people to listen to it. The voice of the radio was nearly the voice of God, because that was the only means of communications that they had.
It was a very interactive radio. People used to call them, talk with them. You know, they used to come, and it was direct. You know, it was always like improvisation.
Tutsi men, women and children were subjected to daily insults and threats. Soon the Interahamwe militia began to conduct military exercises openly. The warning signs could not have been clearer. Around the world, the turbulence in Rwanda had not gone unnoticed. In August 1993, President Habyarimana gave in to pressure from his international allies and signed the Arusha Accords, a peace treaty that promised power sharing with Tutsis. As part of the agreement, the United Nations sent a small peacekeeping force, led by Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire.
What they required was a neutral international force, which included political and humanitarian components, of course, to be referee.
But as UN peacekeepers deployed, Hutu extremists developed a final solution to the Tutsi problem. In addition to utilizing government soldiers and militias, they devised a plan to mobilize ordinary Hutu citizens, civilians who could attack their Tutsi neighbors in local communities. Fear was skillfully exploited.
And in a history like that of Rwanda, where victim and perpetrator had traded places, where the Hutu had living memories of having been victims of Tutsi power, it was not very difficult to convince them of that in the context of a civil war.
Genocide was talked about. There were stories, there were different sources of information giving very clear picture of what was going to happen. There was clear information of how the government was preparing the genocide.
By the end of 1993, unprecedented quantities of machetes and munitions had been imported. In towns and villages, hit lists of Tutsi and Hutu moderates were drawn up. On the 10th of January 1994, the plan for genocide was given its finishing touches. An informant tipped off the commander of the UN peacekeeping force that Hutu extremists were plotting large-scale massacres.
He provided us with details on arms caches, where they were and what they were, how they were distributed, details on the hardliners, who they were, what were their planning. He provided us with concepts of operations that they had where they could kill 1,000 Tutsis in 20 minutes.
General Dallaire immediately faxed the United Nations, announcing his intention to intervene and raid the arms caches. The next day, Kofi Annan, then head of UN peacekeeping, ordered Dallaire to suspend the operation.
New York responded by telling me that that was way beyond my classic mandate, that I did not have authority to do it. The only use of force that you're allowed is in self-defense.
The decision to stay within the strict mandate would prove very costly. On the night of the 6th of April 1994, a plane carrying President Habyarimana and the President of Burundi was shot down on its approach to Rwanda's Kigali airport. The next morning, RTLM radio accused the RPF of killing the president, a charge they deny to this day. Whoever was to blame, Hutu power seekers exploited the assassination to their own advantage. Implementation of the final solution was at hand.